Welcome everybody, I'm Leslie Stevenson. For those of you who don't know me, I run governance publishing and also the Financial Times Board Director Programme. This is a governance event. We're delighted to welcome Patrick Dunne and Helen Baker today, who are going to talk to you about charities. They've both got a huge amount of experience and I'm sure you're going to find it really useful. Just some housekeeping things first. If you could put, we definitely want you to contribute. You can't speak, I'm afraid, but definitely want you to contribute. So if you want to put questions or comments, either in the chat line or in the Q&A, and I'll monitor those and try and feed them through to Patrick and Helen as we go on. The event is being recorded because we want to put it up onto the governance website and also our YouTube channel so that as many people as possible can see it. And I think that's probably all I had to say, so I will hand over to you, Patrick. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Leslie, and hello to everyone. There's a few familiar faces in there, and great that we've got such a good, enthusiastic group today on what's a very important topic, what's been happening with charity boards, and actually, more importantly, sort of where might they be heading. And I can't think of anyone better than Helen to have this chat with. We thought we'd just kick things off a little bit with Helen just sharing a little bit about her experience of the charity or the civil society sector, and then we'll look at kind of, what kind of crisis Helen's had in terms of a board, and then we'll move on. We'll move on from that. So, Helen.
Thank you, Patrick. I was just really going to pick up a few thoughts about what has characterised the charity sector, I think, to this stage, because that has a big influence in terms of how the sector has experienced the pandemic and might be thinking about adapting as we move beyond the pandemic, hopefully. So, I think one of the most characteristic things about and distinctive things about the sector is the sheer diversity. So in terms of thinking about the pandemic and boards, you've always got to take into account there are enormous numbers of charities, many non-registered, many almost entirely volunteer-led with even no paid staff, right through to the enormous national and international agencies that everybody seems to know about. I think the sector comes with, I think one of the things which is distinctive is the fact that so many people come to work in the sector with a really strong sense of personal commitment to the cause. And I think that, again, makes a real difference, both to how charities run and how charities will run, and the way that you need to take staff with you in terms of responding and innovating. I do think actually that the sector has a very well-deserved reputation for being extremely innovative. I mean, many of the most significant changes in the social sector in terms of health and social care have originated in the sector, and I think it still has the potential to be that innovative. Multiple stakeholders, but I think increasingly with a real emphasis and a growing and important emphasis on the voice of people with lived experience of the causes that we're committed to. Sector funding, to an extent, drives a rather more competitive, internally competitive environment, which I think is a challenge. There's a kind of instinct to collaborate because of the passion for causes, but I say the financial structures up to now have tended in many ways to lead to a fairly internally competitive environment, which is a challenge. And certainly well before COVID, there were some really big pushes around the sector's independence. I mean, I think one of the most important defining issues for charities and social enterprise and sort of smaller organic initiatives in local communities has been about maintaining independence. And there's been some real pushback on that from government and media and so on recently. I think before COVID, the sector was already facing really complex issues around Brexit, whole economic uncertainty, sort of accelerating technology, and so many organisations being really quite daunted by the pace of change and the ways of changes and ways of working. So I think it was a sector with very different levels of capacity and confidence as we went into the pandemic. Maybe.
Yeah, and I mean, as talking about the pandemic, and obviously Shelter, which you chose, is a sort of, you know, fantastic charity. I mean, it's a profound kind of shock of the pandemic on everything, really, sort of funding, operating model, you know, all of that. I mean, what for you? I mean, this is not quite have you had a good crisis, Helen, but, you know, kind of what for you have been the biggest kind of things that have affected the way you think about the board and the way the board operates through all of that?
I think it's having to face sort of almost continuously increasing levels of uncertainty, going into something where you didn't know how long the issue was going to continue, how serious it was going to be, what level of adjustment we'd need to make, what our capacity would be, what would be the impact on our funding, in particular, what would be the impact on the people with, you know, that the organisation was set up to work with, to support, to enable. I think a very clear knowledge that whatever happened, it could only get worse across that system. There was some very short-term, very positive interventions put in to support people across the immediate pandemic. But I think we were aware right at the beginning that as soon as those particular protective mechanisms were lifted, the potential for a tsunami of need at a much more serious level was almost inevitable. So it was planning for a tsunami. An unknown tsunami was quite something. It was also, I think, real incentives to collaboration. Thinking much more about local communities, local teams, the knowledge that people had on the ground. I think when something is really complex, you need to be able to think much more about the knowledge, the understanding and the experience at the front line and in local communities. So one of the real challenges for the board was not just thinking about how to give the exec much more clearly defined but flexible, agile space to work in, but also actually how to devolve decision-making with much more confidence, much further away to the front line and in local communities. And that was really exciting, but it demanded very new ways of working, and trust and resilience, I think, came right to the fore in terms of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talking about the decision making. It's one of the things I think at the beginning that I've thought a lot about is the way that we've been making decisions are now going to work in this environment where, you know, everything seems to be up in the air. You don't know how long this is going to last. You fundamentally change your operating model, but then, you know, that might soon become irrelevant again. So yes. How do you get that? And in terms of just that balance of oversight and support between the board and the exec, you need to cut them some slack. You know, there's tremendous pressures to do things, but also you need to be responsible and have some oversight. But and I've done a LinkedIn article about this, that I felt that we were moving from a sort of map world to a sat-nav world, if that makes sense, where we were we had an annual budget, we had a strategic plan, you know, we told our funders this is what their money would be used for. And all of a sudden, you know, those things were interesting and they were still guides, but to follow them rigorously and blindly at that point would have been catastrophic for most organizations. So an approach which was more dynamic, more like sat-nav, where you're making decisions when you get near the next junction.
Yes,
that seemed to be a more appropriate way to manage through that. But of course, you need the team, the finance function in particular, to be able to provide that live or nearly live information, to be able to make those later kind of calls, judgment calls. And you need a board where the people are more kind of comfortable with a bit less tight control, a bit more trust, and a bit less certainty. And, you know, the whole issue around just reserves, what reserves should you keep? Because, you know, traditionally the mantra has been, you know, you shouldn't really have much in the way of reserves because you should be spending those for your beneficiaries. But on the other hand, if those people who had very thin reserves at the beginning of the pandemic were really, they had their room to maneuver was really small. They couldn't invest in more digital, or they couldn't do those things. How did you kind of wrestle with those sorts of issues? And is that right? Did you move from a maps to a sat-nav world, or?
I think I've always thought that, in fact, the role of the board is to create a kind of secure framework. So to an extent, I suppose I've always seen sat-nav as being a very relevant way of a board working most effectively and efficiently. So I think the board sets the strategic framework, establishes the budget, the values, the ways of working. But I think the board's responsibility is, once having defined those, working with the exec and listening to people in the organisation and other stakeholders. I think once you have that in place, the board's role, in a sense, the most effective board stands away and gives space within that environment. And that's both space to innovate, to take risk and whatever, but also a space in which you can be assured that if you get something wrong, you will still be supported within that framework. I like your concept of frameworks in the sat-nav world. So within Shelter, for example, we took that way of thinking but sharpened it up. So we came together as a board and exec at the beginning, particularly, for example, around the budget, and made very clear decisions, particularly relating to reserves and cash flow. So those were the two things we thought were absolutely fundamental. We established where we thought those had to be, and those were in fact tighter than they would have been in a less uncertain environment. We then very clearly negotiated between us the levels of delegation. So what space had the executive got, and we made as much space as possible to allow the executive more space to be agile, to take risks, to be really flexible and responsive. But at what point would that a decision need to come back to a committee or come back to board for a decision? We also thought about what would be the triggers which would bring an issue back. If something were going wrong, at what point would that need to trigger a sort of longer discussion and so on?
Yeah, and I think that just that simple fact of having a discussion about how are we going to decide about these particular things, I found that really helped a lot with the exec. So there wasn't a kind of, this is the right way to do it or the wrong way to do it. It was what might be the best way for us for these particular decisions. And that, I mean, I bore people with this, and apologies for those of you that have heard this before, but this concept of the Venn diagram where you've got the exec and the board and that space in the middle, I think that was bulging during the pandemic. And what's interesting now is, as we enter this next phase, because it's not over yet, I think, that sort of bulge has been coming back a bit, but it's not gone back to where it was beforehand, I think. And one of the things that I found interesting is, most charities will have something called a scheme of delegation, which is written down when the charity is formed and reviewed from time to time. But that discussion about what is it you need to come back to us on, and what I found generally in my experience of the pandemic is actually the board has been more comfortable increasing the flexibility for the management team, given where they trust them, where you've got these parameters in place. So, but if our reserves are going to dip below this, then, you need to come back to us. But if they're not, if they're within the range that we think is comfortable, then, fine, you get on, you do it. What else have you noticed about that relationship with the board and the exec, Helen, as in terms of how it might have changed and adapted or developed through the thing?
I think we've had to learn to disagree more easily, or to be more patient and less panic-stricken if there is a disagreement, because I think negotiating that framework around budget at the beginning of the year, it was incredibly effective. It did mean that actually the board could step out of the way which in some ways is one of the best contributions the board can make, is to step out of the way and create really open space for the exec to work with confidence. It doesn't mean to say those original discussions were easy, and we've had to be prepared to be very open and challenge each other across the year. So inevitably, when things are under stress and uncertain, what we have done is we've gone back and we've kind of taken big issues and tried to be more explicit about how we make decisions about things. So, for example, going back to risk appetite, what is our risk appetite between us? Because I think you can, we did a very interesting piece of work the other day about aligning our truths. And actually very often you can work very closely with somebody or with colleagues and you think you absolutely both understand in the same way what you've said or what you mean or what you're committed to. And I don't think that any organisation or any team is brilliant at this, but there is a real challenge as well as an incentive to go back and to ask much more clearly, to take a risk, to ask, to say, did you actually mean that?
Yeah,
have I understood that this is what we have said we're going to do? So as a chair, one of the things was to try and capture in words as clearly as possible when we'd had a discussion. Can we just try and capture that? You know, sort of clear short notes which said, so this is what we've said, and does everybody agree to move to the next stage? So there's been a lot of working together, as well as a lot more trying to give space.
Yeah, I think that's great. And actually on that space point, there's a really good question from David that says, do you think there's a more crucial need to get closer to first line the first line of defense operations? I mean, have a closer monitoring of the execution of the strategy and the blocking points. Well, I think it's an interesting balance, isn't it? Because if you don't understand the organization and you don't understand the operating model or the financial dynamic, then it's very hard to make the right decisions as a board. So I think board members do need to have visibility on how it all works and how that's changing, which means, you know, getting out and about and understanding things. But that doesn't mean interfering with day-to-day operations. I think the supplementary point you made around monitoring the execution of the strategy and blocking points, I think it's a really powerful one, because when you look back at decisions that have been made and you look at and you think of the ones that were clangers, often it's not that we made the wrong choice, it's we got the implementation wrong. And that's why I've been a proponent of this early, mid, late approach to making decisions, where you basically spend some time thinking, you know, as Helen was saying, what are the big decisions we need to take, and how are we going to make them, and when are we going to take those decisions, and who are we going to get involved? I think then at the end of the process, the late bit, you can actually spend a bit more time thinking, okay, so if we do this, is this the right implementation plan to maximize the success of that decision we've just taken, which historically, I think most of the effort, and sometimes the board gets exhausted in reaching a conclusion of what to do and doesn't think about how that's going to be done in quite as much depth. And I think that's been a really important kind of development for a lot of boards, this breaking down, not deciding just on one Wednesday afternoon on one board paper, but actually, you know, maybe a little bit more of an iterative process around it, which isn't prevaricating. And actually by taking this slightly more adaptive, flexible approach, you can do that. There's no shame in today not being the day where we get on with it. I think
most organisations have had to think really hard about adapting ways of working. So for a start, you know, everybody was working from home. So for, you know, immediately enormous responsibility towards the health and well-being of staff. And that needs to come absolutely front and centre. But it feels even more important in that case that actually staff should feel trusted and valued, and that at the front line, people should have a real sense of there being some space for them to respond and do what feels most important and most effective to them. I mean, I think the issue about whether or not the board is visible, it's that kind of leadership across that period of uncertainty, and thinking about, again, sometimes that implementation is best put into practice at the front line and then comes back up the system. And I think that so the board, I think, needs to be confident. Again, I think it's about establishing that framework, and also then actually saying you trust people sufficiently that you don't have to have enormous amounts of stuff visible. I mean, for a start, in many ways, we've got a fantastically strong executive team who are very well known across Shelter. So actually the board stepping in, we talked about this explicitly, but the board stepping in and insisting on being visible in that context probably was just going to make that line of sight more complicated. Yeah. What we needed was clarity, simplicity, visibility of leadership. But in this case, I think we made a judgment that the board needed to really know about what was happening, what the risks were, how people were feeling. And that's about data coming in and lines of visibility. But it didn't have to be the board who were visible to the staff in order to give confidence and clarity about what was important and what we were doing and what we were not doing, if you see what I mean.
No, absolutely get that. I mean, changing the tack slightly, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed that was changing through the whole thing was the composition of the board. And you know, I think you've got a very diverse board. You know, the boards on our two, and it wasn't just about diversity. It was also about a number of things, really. I think the pandemic was a great test to see whether people stepped up and whether they could be supportive and provide oversight during a period of great stress for most organisations. Yeah. So I found, and if my conversations with search firms in the space are saying, board churn is up, and that's because some people haven't stepped up and they're being replaced. It's because some people have self-selected because it's a more demanding role now, so they maybe drop one of their appointments to make that work. And for some, it's the whole risk and, now the organisation is not going to have the strategy it was going to have. It's not going to be as much fun for them, or their fit with it doesn't fit. And there's a whole range of reasons why. But have you noticed that, Helen, that board composition is changing, not just on Shelter, but in other?
So in several organisations I'm involved with, board members have joined and left. Very quickly, because I do think they're unless in a sense, and one of the things about the governance of charities is there has until relatively recently been very little support for the development and training of board members, and in particular chairs, to be honest. And we've now got the Association of Chairs, which is a superb organisation, bringing together chairs and supporting their learning and development. But I think governance can feel, I mean, the amount of regulation, there's sort of very public challenges to whether or not charities could be trusted, and all of that on top of a very unknown environment, the risks around finance. I mean, probably the greatest levels of risk we've carried coming at pace, and without necessarily being able to predict when they're coming and what they're going to be. I mean, I think a lot of people would step away and go, actually, there's enough going on in my own life, thank you. Or I'm carrying too diverse a mix of responsibilities myself, and I have to narrow down. So I think this last year has been quite a sort of test of fire for those board members who are able to manage risk, to deal with uncertainty, but who can also, and I think probably the most important thing is see the positives, the excitement, the opportunities which have emerged from a period of such radical change in the environment around us. I mean, the levels of opportunity now that to work differently, to think differently, to use resource differently is very dynamic. So those board members who've come through will have earned some very positive bonuses, as well as offered some very, very valuable commitment and energy across a really difficult period.
Yeah, and as a chair, you can, I mean, often in these, you know, in a dark situation, the sort of jewels shine the brightest, don't they? And sometimes you haven't spotted that's a jewel, but suddenly it becomes so clear and evident. And I've certainly found that in all the boards I'm involved in, that, you know, there have been people who've just been absolutely amazing. And, you know, I think I've seen across the boards, you know, a few more potential chairs, and I've been encouraging a few of them. You know, you're a fantastic trustee. You've actually got what it takes to be a chair. But your point around development and training, there isn't much. And you know, it's one of the reasons that in the boards book I devoted quite a bit of time to the sector and some of the case studies, because there doesn't seem to be a lot. The other aspect around boards is the whole. You talked about it before in terms of involving people with lived experience or beneficiaries, and what a lot of people are doing now is the sort of next gen board type approach, and having maybe the chair of that on the board of the charity itself. How have you sort of approached this at Shelter?
Well, across each organisation I work with, and lots of the organisations I'm involved with, have very, very different levels of maturity and confidence or commitment, actually. I think, interestingly, I think in many ways it's the smallest, most organic sort of local enterprises for whom the voice of people with lived experience has just been defining. And very often it's those people who set up the organisation and therefore are automatically sitting on the board and defining the purpose and making really big judgments about direction of travel and priorities and so on. I think in some ways it's been harder for the larger organisations to flex to that, just because there are so many voices. I mean, I think one of the big challenges for charities altogether is just the number of stakeholders. I mean, how many voices and how many sets of stakeholders do you have to listen to? Because it's not just about making the choice yourself as an organisation, because you've got your regulators, you've got your commissioners, you've got government, you've got local government, you've got your health system around you, you've got sort of which voice you listen to and how you make space in that really dynamic, loud sets of environments with different demands for the voice of people with experience of the issue you're concerned with. It can be quite a challenge.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, in a rather wacky dyslexic way, one of the things I came across a number of years ago, which I found incredibly helpful for that challenge, was piece of work done by Cranfield, where you basically put in, it's on one page, you can do the, I mean, you might need a big page, but it's one page. You put your blobs of, you know, the stakeholders, maybe start with half a dozen, and then you put on the, I always get this wrong, you put on the left what they want and need from you, and you put on the right what you want and need from them, and out of that comes your kind of, the first thing is, you know, well, how do you know you're delivering what they want, and how do you know you're getting what you need from them? And then out of that is, well, where do you want that to be? And then actually drawing the line between the two, the strategy, it becomes more straightforward. But it's very easy, if you don't do that, to forget about one group. This happens in corporate boards as well. You know, people who just focus on the shareholders forget about the customers and end up having no customers and grumpy shareholders. And you know, these things are sort of all interdependent with each other. But I found that, you know, particularly when you're starting up a charity or you're re-energizing one or whatever you're doing, I think being clear about who are the stakeholders, first of all, what do they want from you? What do you want from them? And that I found has been a really helpful tool. There's a good question here from Jeff relating to an earlier point, which was, are you seeing an uplift in charities targeting or considering private sector board level or exec candidates as opposed to selecting from the charity sector? What's your take on that, Helen?
Oh, I don't know about you, but I mean, I think any board that I know has got a mixture already. I mean, there's an assumption you will be looking for representation from different sectors, different ways of making decisions, different mindsets, different, diversity in all its senses, if you see what I mean. So I don't think, I mean, interestingly, I do think that charity boards are very, very open to private sector experience. I think it doesn't work nearly so well the other way around.
No, it doesn't.
In a sense, my challenge would be the other way around. Because, I mean, I've chaired organisations with 7,000 staff and 180 million turnover, and can't tell you how many stakeholders, and that's a very complex piece of leadership, which would probably be a bit bigger than many private sector organisations and probably more complex than many. But it is more difficult to make the transition from charity board into private sector board. But I think it is very, very positive that there's a much wider sense of collaborative and sharing learning across the system altogether, and definitely cross-sector. I mean, I think that's a real benefit to the sector.
I absolutely agree. And I think it's always back to this question, why? Why do you want someone? I remember when I was at 3i being approached with a number of charities, and the why was really because we think you'll be able to get us more money. or we think it'll look good in our next funding pitch, or they obviously didn't know me very well, or things like that, rather than you can help us get a better strategy or do whatever. One of the things just to sort of related to that, it's around the diversity point. I mean, I think one of the joys of having a more diverse board is you have a broader range of views, and that's very good. One of the challenges and things to manage is managing those diverse views and reaching a conclusion, that although everybody, not every person might agree with every aspect of it, but the board will be committed to that decision. How have you found that process evolving over the last while?
To an extent, it's almost been easier over the last 12 months because the external pressures have been such that sort of as a chair, in a sense, you can lean in rather more, and working with your chief exec, and when there are things which really, really need to move at pace and we need a decision, you can lean in. I think normally I think a chair's role is very much negotiation, mediation, whatever. I think one of the things that does help in that environment is actually to create space for wider discussion. So making decisions about those things which can come through on a consent agenda, making really strong use of board committees to deal with detail, to advise strongly about more detailed decisions to be taken. If you are a big enough charity to have committees, of course. But also, I think actually making space within board meetings, which is incredibly difficult when you're working at pace, but really trying to hold on to wider space to have bigger, more open discussion about things which are potentially problematic, but where all our different perspectives produce really rich learning potentially if we stop and listen, as opposed to dash through to get to the quickest and fastest decision, if you see what I mean.
Reflection is a much underrated thing to do, I think, and I always find it really helpful following each board meeting to reflect on that. Not necessarily straight away. Sometimes, it's good to have that 15 minutes at the end that's trustee only time that you might do some of that. But actually, usually over the next weekend, you're just thinking about not just the decisions and not just the things that you came, but, you know, that Joe seemed a bit exercised by this, or Ngozi seemed a bit sort of, you know, whatever it might be, but just reflection is a really good thing. There's a great question in the Q&A about, it's wonderful to hear about the dynamic from Sarah Ridley, that dynamic and adaptable ways large charities with highly professional staff have worked. Which lessons do you think are particularly relevant to smaller organisations with less experienced staff?
Actually, I think, interestingly, I think some of the smallest organisations have been the most dynamic, have been the most collaborative, have been the most responsive and agile. So in practice, I think there's a great deal that the larger, more hierarchical, traditional, tightly structured organisations could learn an enormous amount from smaller frontline charities and enterprises. And I think one of the real pleasures and one of the massive opportunities coming out of COVID is actually thinking about how we bring together that capacity to be agile, to know your local system, to respond, to engage the voice of people with experience of the issue, you know, absolutely have them front and center. How to keep the whole system linked up. So actually there has been much more linkage, there's been much more thinking about the whole system and how the whole system, the different sectors, the different size of organisation, the formal, the organic, the whatever, actually thinking about systemic change, what has been made possible, what could be contemplated now. And one of the really exciting things is how you hold on to that. So
I think that's
how
right.
we've all got an interest in that, and how we manage to hold that complexity and open up to all that learning. At the same time, we're all still facing challenge and uncertainty and difficulty in terms of just the day-to-day management. Don't you think it's?
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole sort of partnering, collective impact, whatever way you want to describe it, how that's moving along. There's another question here from I can just see Samu. It may be Samuel, or maybe a longer, but it says, what are the KPIs for a charity board besides profit? What are the major differences between KPIs and those of a private sector board? Well, I mean, I think my take on this, and about you, Helen, is that it goes back to the purpose, really. I mean, the main KPI should be related to, are you fulfilling your purpose? So, you know, if you're set up to do whatever it is in particular, then the KPIs ought to relate back to that purpose. I would tend to have sort of hard KPIs, and then in my mind I have some more qualitative things. So one of the things that, in terms of a KPI for a board, and I think this runs across whether it's a charity or a private sector or any other sort of board, is the quality of relationships. And I don't mean that everybody's, you know, hugging each other and they're all happy, but are they good, robust relationships where there's a high degree of respect, there's a high degree of trust, there's a high degree of tolerance and listening, and an ability to empathize with very different views to your own, and reach a collective supportive decision. And you can always tell this. I think, you know, whenever you observe a board, you can see, feel, hear it. And one of my favorite ways is sort of, there's always been imagining what's in the thought bubbles around the table, as well as just what I'm hearing. You can get a real sense of sort of whether they are a together band or whether they're a rabble when you do that. I don't know about you, Helen.
I mean, I think there's always a tension around what are the proper KPIs? What is a small enough set of KPIs for a board to have a proper line of vision through to what matters? I think you're absolutely right, Patrick. The fundamental thing is defining is hold to purpose. So what is it that might get in the way of our delivering our purpose if we don't do that effectively, or if we don't control that carefully, if you see what I mean? I think a lot of organisations, again, I think have a wider performance framework. So there's a whole set of KPIs across the organisation as a whole. And the challenge for the board is, which of those do you pull out of that wider performance framework to bring up to be the ones which the board needs to see, because sometimes the KPIs can actually relate to something which is apparently very small, but could be absolutely fundamental as a trigger if it goes wrong.
Yeah.
So it could be, you know, I mean, I've been part of an organisation where one of the most fundamental things is if your frontline reception team moved on or were not working well, then that would be absolutely critical to the whole way that the organisation was managing, again, across the period of stress. But I think what's the interesting thing about the KPIs, it's partly absolutely relates to strategy, but that also needs to think about the risk map. So in the same way, you would have your risk register and think about what the things are which might get in the way of you delivering your purpose, which is fundamentally your risks. But again, which of those come up to the board level? So you would only expect the board to be really owning maybe 5 or 6 of those.
Yeah, I was going to say it needs to be small, doesn't it? I mean, one fascinating experience I had when we founded Warwick in Africa, which teaches children and trains teachers in slums and rural areas of poverty in a number of African countries. We were working in a lot of places where there was no electricity. It was sort of data devoid environment, if you like. And I felt that we should have KPIs. There was sort of view that, well, it's very hard to have KPIs because the environment. And I said, well, why don't we start with 3? Why don't we start with how much the children's capability improves, so we can test them, you know, over a period, how much their maths and English developing. What happens to attendance while we're doing these things? Does it go up or does it go down? Because that's another thing. And what's our bangs per buck? By which I meant, what is the cost for one young person to go through one of these programs? And it was interesting in our first year, the bang per buck measure was £44 a child for a month. Now that's below 10.
Wow.
And it's only because we had that KPI that we were thinking, actually, if we can keep the quality, the other 2 were the more important metrics, but if the attendance is increasing, the capabilities are increasing, and we can help more young people for less unit cost, then, you know, we will have a bigger impact. And I think in the charity sector, it's often unpopular with some people to talk about bangs per buck. And to think about that. I mean, you know, the concept of return on social investment is sort of well known and well talked about, but fundamentally, really, really within charities, sometimes people are uncomfortable at saying, you know, well, let's lower the unit cost it takes to put a person through our program. And, you know, that's a sort of business-minded way of thinking about it, but actually it's a very social way of thinking about it, because you can help more people for the same money.
I mean, somebody just picked up in the chat and said it should be about, one of them fundamentally should be about the level of satisfaction of people that the organisation is working with and for, if you see what I mean. And that's absolutely true. It's not always easy to isolate one simple KPI from that. So I think that's one of the most important areas that a board needs to consider is how really, you know, which element do you pick up? Is it about satisfaction? Is it about outcomes delivered? Is it about, and how do you bring that voice into the board properly, so that's really influencing? The hardest thing in each case is that you can deliver what look like or bring together a set of very tidy KPIs, but they don't necessarily tell you everything you need to know. So I mean, the whole point is that you have, as a board, you need to bring different lines of sight in.
I agree. I mean, it's interesting. Sorry, Helen.
No, I'm just saying, it's partly about, as you say, about the board being out and about. I mean, in normal times, the board being out and about and visible, and actually having a real sense by being at the front line and sort of talking to people. It's also about you know, the voice of people who are using the services or involved in the services. It's what do our commissioners think about us? It's you know, what's going on in the sector at the moment, and to what extent does our practice reflect what is considered best practices. So it's actually having lots of different lines of sight on how well the organisation is doing.
And seldom about one thing.
You need to bring them, if they're aligned and they make sense together, then you can pretty much rely on them. But just to have a set of KPIs is going to give you only it's going to give you it's going to give you an adequate but not a rich mindset. I mean, one of the interesting things is we were talking about this last week in a board meeting, and somebody said, well, of course, actually, some of the very largest, most successful commercial organisations have one KPI. They have one, you know, and they are really successful. They're really dynamic, busy, whatever. And that was a really good challenge to us as a charity to go. I don't think it works for us, but I mean, it's a really challenge. If we could only have one, what would it be?
I suspect they don't really. But my favorite KPI is called Twinkle, and you know, I'm a mathematician and you know, hard-headed businessman, and I like my normal KPIs, but you know, going back to work in Africa, one of my favorite KPIs is the twinkle I see, particularly in young women's eyes when they think they can do maths when they've been told they can't. And that for me, when I see that, when I'm visiting the schools, you know, I always joke with the team, you know, what's the twinkle factor like been today? And you know, because for me, that energizing and creating that excitement around maths or English, and that ambition that, you know, I can go a bit further is just a great thing. Now Ray has got a good question in here. You'll like this one, Helen, I think. Says, Shelton is a good example of a charity CEO having an amazing impact on national policy as well as leading the charity itself. There are others, of course, but I'd be hard-pressed to name trustees with similar outward standing. Is there a greater role that boards could play in that external policy influence role? I think that's a brilliant
That's point. A really good question. Yeah. I think it comes down again to a sense that the board and the exec are one joint team, that we have different roles within the team, but actually I think the most effective boards bring those skills of the exec and the board together, and in a sense it's a team. In the same way, I think that the chair and the chief exec are a team, and you make choices, and I think the most effectively make choices when you actively discuss the choices about which of you is going to be front facing. Because I think it's very confusing, very often for staff, for other people, if the chair and the chief exec keep standing up in public and making announcements and engaging. So certainly in terms of, I mean, Polly is an absolutely outstanding leader in the sector. She's very visible. She's powerful in terms of her influence. She's incredibly thoughtful. Therefore, she and I make a very explicit decision that she stands to the front and I support her. So we speak with a joint voice, but hers is the voice which is out there in public. So to an extent, I think it's a really good question from the questioner. I don't think it really matters whether it's an executive voice or a non-executive voice. I think it matters it's a clarity of voice, and that the leadership of the organisation stands with and behind that voice, so that you can have confidence that when then that one very visible organisation stands up and says something, you can have confidence that it is representing the different voices in the organisation.
Yeah, and also for many chairs, they may not be the public face in that way of the organisation, but they're, I can use an old Scouse expression, but they're deadly behind the bike sheds. You know, they don't make a big, you know, they're not very evident, but all those little quiet words and those influencing, because to get policies changed, you know, there's a lot of skills required for that.
And I think good chairs are networkers. So actually, a good chair and a good board will bring in voice, knowledge, experience, and relationships from way beyond the organisation. And that's the real richness that a board brings. And then it focuses through whoever is either identified externally or chosen internally, and sometimes the both, to be the voice of the organisation. I think it's
Yeah.
It's very fluid, but you just need the voice is very important. I also think, actually, just dipping back about lived experience, I think the best organisations, or the organisations which are going to be the most effective, are those where it isn't necessarily the chief exec who's always in the limelight. It is actually about the organisation.
I was going to say,
to create platforms for other people to have a voice and to influence, up to government, across to local commissioners, widely across local communities. But it's not necessarily always the best thing if there's one voice, because it is really the voice of the people with lived experience that we should be creating the space and providing the platform for.
Yeah,
I think that's changing. That's, that's something which is moving and has moved a lot during the pandemic, I think, actually.
Yeah, and Thea's got a good point here about, I'll summarize it, but the punchline is, trustee positions are not remunerated, and the charity doesn't want to take up too much time for new board members. Is this something that is changing? And what can be done to ensure everybody's up to speed? I mean, I think there are charities where you have a sort of trophy person, and they can't really contribute very much because of their time commitment. I don't think, generally speaking, that the absence of paying trustees is a problem for those sort of people. I think where that's a problem is actually at the other end of the age spectrum, or for some people with specific lived experience, where they're losing time off work and they can't afford it, and just most people you can pay expenses, but I think there's a difficult judgment to be made if you want a more diverse board and you want younger people on the board, as to whether you are going to want to have some sort of financial incentive, but at the moment you can't really, so it's difficult.
I think I actually don't think that paying a board member in a charity is any more likely to corrupt the board member than it does paying our executives. I mean, it's quite an interesting, it's for so many centuries been a defining distinction about the charity sector, that it's voluntary, and that trustees are unpaid and therefore are uncorrupted and are objective. But we'd never say that of our executives. The fact we pay our executives,
no, I know,
we pay our staff, doesn't mean, it doesn't mean their passion is any less, or that they're any less capable of making really sound objective judgments. So I think the issue is much, much more wanting to encourage the diversity of how accessible board membership is for a much, much wider group of people. And if that involves offering at least some kind of honorarium, then I would thoroughly support that. And I think the Charity Commission isn't saying no anymore, but neither is it encouraging. So we're in an interim phase with that one.
Probably one final, maybe two, we've got one or two more. So there's a lovely quote here. Yes, the twinkle must start from within, and twinkle, and this is really about culture. It's all about the people creating the culture. And one of the things I feel very strongly is that most boards are individually there for sort of say 6 years. So culture you can't microwave; it takes time. So you're only going to be able to sort of develop the culture during your time. But I think it's a very important role of the board to be exercised about, to know what culture we've got, to know what culture we want, to know, how are we actually adapting the culture as we go. And one of the sort of truisms to me is it's very hard to get the culture that you want without people who are, of that culture. So if you're recruiting senior people, it's not just about competence, and it's not just about ability or effectiveness. It's as much about, will they be someone who will move that culture forwards in the direction that you want to go. And it doesn't mean they're clones, because you want the diversity. But I mean, what's your take on that, Helen?
No, I think culture is absolutely fundamental. And when I was talking earlier about the board creating the outer secure framework of the organisation, of those things which are defining and therefore can't be flexed, if you see what I mean. I think culture is one of those. I mean, I think it's absolutely, values and culture are fundamental. Now, a board doesn't determine those entirely, because that should be something which comes from the whole organisation and is shaped by the whole organisation and owned by the whole organisation. But it is, I think, one of the most profoundly important things a board is accountable for, is the culture. And I think the best organisations actively invest in thinking about and supporting the development of the culture within the organisation. It's absolutely critical, and I agree entirely about appointments at any level of the organisation should reflect the culture as much as they reflect the formal skills and knowledge, I think.
Yeah, completely. So we've got 3 or 4 minutes left, Helen. I think, is there anything that you've really wanted to sort of put out there and say that we haven't covered so far?
I just think that one of the defining changes and opportunities for us as boards now is thinking about the systems. I think it's very easy, when under a lot of pressure, to be driven to make a whole series of transactional decisions, internally facing transactional decisions. I think the opportunities which emerge now as we move out of COVID are thinking about collaboration, thinking about systemic change, which is going to change the whole framework in which things are happening. So you're not endlessly dealing with more and more and more individual problems, that actually charities can work across systems much more collaboratively and look at really profound systemic change, which becomes possible when you think about a whole network of organisations rather than just individuals. That, of course, is an immense challenge for boards. I mean,
but at least if you have a go, then we might stand a chance. But what a lovely point to... lovely point to end, and I can see Leslie's appeared.
Yes,
the clock. So Leslie, back to you, and a wonderful conversation, Helen. Thank you.
That was really enjoyable. Thank you. And lovely, great question.
Very much. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think it's really interesting. The points that you make are all so valid, and I think they extend beyond the charity sector. An awful lot of the points you're making are actually relevant, whatever side of the board you are. I love your Twinkle Factor, Patrick. I know exactly what you mean. That's absolutely brilliant, and it should be a KPI for everybody. I also love the fact that you've really emphasised the importance of trust on the board, between the board and the stakeholders, between the board and management, that building relationships, which is really what it's all about. And I'm very excited that you're so enthusiastic about the opportunities and seeing opportunities, not just challenges. So thank you very much, both of you. Thank you to everyone at home for some fantastic questions. We will send around a note which will have the link for the recording if you want to watch it later or share it or what have you. But for now, I'll just say thank you very much to both of you, to all of you, and goodbye.